everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is a very special event, a live discussion with very talented author Ariel Lawhon, in which we'll be able to hear a bit about her process, her most recently released book, and you'll be able to post your own questions too. Now, before I introduce myself or anyone else, I do want to say that we have some local weather that's acting up on us. So there is a small chance that may interrupt our live stream this evening, but we will be taking care of that as much as we can, even if we need to reschedule. So don't you fear, this is going to continue on one way or the other. So there's lots of ways that you may have heard about tonight's event. If you saw this advertised on our library page, you may not know that this event is one of a series created by Humanities Tennessee in partnership with the Tennessee State Library and Archives. So Humanities Tennessee is an incredible nonprofit. They foster and celebrate ideas, stories, history, arts, and culture throughout our state. And they actually do a little bit of everything, but I'd say they're probably most well known for this Neighborhood Story Project and the Southern Festival of Books. They are our state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and they're kind of a big deal. So this is a big fat honor that we are able to do this with them. If you'd like to know more about them, you can go to humtn.org. or their literary page, which is chapter16.org. That's chapter 16, the numbers 16.org. Or, of course, visit their Facebook or Instagram pages. Now, on the other hand, if you're viewing this event because of Humanities Tennessee, let me introduce myself and my location. My name is Catherine McBride. I'm the director of the library, McIvers Grant Public Library. We're in Dyersburg, Tennessee. My staff and I were over the moon about having been chosen to participate in this event. So we've actually spent this month creating a collection of virtual programs, all centered around the marvelous book we'll be discussing tonight, codename Hélène. If you'd like to get in on the fun, you can go to our Facebook page, our YouTube page, our website, McIvers Grant Public Library, MCIVERS.org. And if you have found this recording after the event, because our guest author has so graciously allowed us to retain this recording as an end cap to our YouTube series, pause me right now, and go get yourself a copy of the book before listening to the rest of the event tonight. If you have a library card, you can request a copy from any library in the country. Get a digital copy. You can ask your library to purchase a copy, or, as we know book lovers everywhere do, you can get your library copy and then also buy yourself one to have forever. Finally, I hope we've built up a little bit of a drum roll in our heads. I'd like to introduce our guest of honor, Ariel Lawhon. She is the author of The Wife, the Maid, and the Mistress, Field of Dreams, I Was Anastasia, of course, codename Hélène. She's gotten glowing reviews in the New York Times. She's been mentioned in People magazine, USA Today, the New York Post. For those of us who are bookies out there, Publishers Weekly, Book Page, Book List, and the Kirkus Review. Whew. So she is definitely a big deal, and we are so pleased she has agreed to do this with us tonight. So please welcome with me Ariel Lawhon.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we are so excited. So I'll be honest, I read a little bit of your press and I started to sweat a little bit about tonight. But then, of course, I saw that you live in Nashville, and I don't know, there's something about a celebrity living in your home state that kind of brings them back down to like lovely, regular, normal person status. So I'm curious, have you always been a Tennessean?
I have not. And I also assure you, I am not a celebrity. I am just a mom. I actually grew up in New Mexico. I moved here for the first time when I was 16. I was on my own, and I lived here for a number of years, and then eventually got married and had a couple kids, moved to Texas, had a couple more kids, and then moved back here roughly 10 years ago, give or take a bit. I forget.
Okay, yeah, so lots of experience and travel that you're bringing to this. And then, and you know, before the event started, we already talked about this a little bit. I would love it if you could tell our audience a little bit about one of your family members that I read a beautiful blog post about.
Yes. So I believe you were talking about our sweet black lab, Maggie.
I am.
She showed up. I kid you not. She showed up on our doorstep. She was about 9 months old, 2 hours after I told my husband, if we are supposed to have a dog, God will drop one on our doorstep. very pregnant and very irrational at the time. And she was, we lost her about this time last year. She was the world's best dog. And if you've ever had a dog that was almost human, you know what I mean? She could walk into a room and she could tell who was sad, and she would go put her head on their knee.
Yeah.
And as many labs do, her lifespan was a little shorter. So she lived about 13 years. And last year during the pandemic, she finally passed. But it was honestly one of the sweetest, most meaningful things that I have ever seen, because we were all six of us were able to go to the vet. We took her to the vet, and we were able to go into the room, and we stayed with her to the very end. And our then 11-year-old laid on the floor, and he put his hands on her face. And literally the last thing she ever saw or heard was our youngest son saying, "You're a good dog, Maggie. You're a good dog." So we had her cremated, and she is now in our backyard. We planted a tree over her, and we call it the Maggie tree. And last year in school, our youngest child, again, heard that plants grow faster if you talk kindly to them. So we see him once or twice a week out there petting the tree and telling the tree that she's a good dog and she should grow fast.
You are killing me over here. Oh my goodness.
True beginning to end. I kid you not.
Wow. So I know everyone, of course, heard me mention your blog post. Ariel does have a website and a blog, and of course, I encourage everyone to take a look at it. It was really a lot of fun reading through that and looking at things. So, goodness. Oh.
Sorry.
No. That was an absolutely beautiful story. So let's move a little bit into authorship and publishing and whatnot in general. I know, of course, you've gotten this question a lot, but it's just so interesting. Would you describe for us a little bit about your journey into publishing? Especially, I noticed obviously The Wife, the Maid, and the Mistress was published in 2014. So was this a lifelong dream of yours, or did you have a different start to your work as an author?
Both, actually. I'm not sure how familiar you are with my story, but it really begins, let's see, I'm 42. So it begins about 37 years ago in Taos, New Mexico. I'm not sure if you're familiar with where that is, but it's northern New Mexico, about 90 miles below the Colorado border. And it's an old ski town, and that's where I was born and raised. I jokingly say that my parents were founding members of the hippie movement. So they moved to Taos to live off the grid before I was born. And I'm one of 6 children, and they raised all 6 of us in a house at the end of a 6-mile dirt road that has no running water, no electricity, no indoor plumbing. We had a cistern and an outhouse and a handful of kerosene lanterns. Sounds so Laura Ingalls, I know. It's kind of Laura Ingalls meets the hippie movement. But the astonishing thing is that my parents read to us, not just as very, very young children who couldn't read, but into our grade school and even adolescent years. And I am convinced that it was during those nights, long winter nights in many cases, being read to by the light of a kerosene lantern, that I fell in love with words and fell in love with stories. And to be honest with you, this is the only thing I have ever wanted to do. It is the only career I have ever pursued. And I knew by the time I was really young, 5, 6 maybe, that this was the path I wanted my life to take. And I am fortunate, so fortunate that it worked out, because I'm pretty sure that I am unemployable otherwise.
That is so interesting what you talk about, though, how you first experienced literature with your family in such a unique way. I'm really drawn to audiobooks. I think a lot of people are, and I love having stories read to me, especially by people who love you. That just brings out a whole other level. Here at the library, we talk so much to families about the joy and the benefit of reading to your children at any age, at every age, how it, all sorts of areas of your brain are being fired when you are listening to stories beyond just your sort of literary or language skills. It's just an entire experience. Wow.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, last year, this current school year and last year, our two youngest children were homeschooled for a variety of reasons, COVID being no small part of it. And they had a reading list assigned by the teachers that they have, apart from me. And some of the books we listened to on audiobook, and that was great, and they enjoyed it. And then some of the books I read aloud to them, and it was really fascinating to note that the books that I read aloud, their comprehension level went up. And I'm convinced there's got to be science there, that there's something about a mother's voice in a child's mind that they hear and they understand in ways they wouldn't otherwise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, that gives me chills. So I'm curious too, from obviously your relationship with your books has changed, I would assume, from the first to your most recent, but I'm really particularly interested in the process and the journey of that very first title, especially as it transitioned from the creation part where it was, your baby in your hands into publication. So would you maybe delve into that a little bit?
Absolutely. I was actually telling a friend yesterday and she's writing her first novel. The biggest thing that changes, I think, from your first to your second or your first to your fifth is your level of confidence. When you're working on your first novel, you're not sure if you can finish, if you can edit, if you can make it what it needs to be. But once you have finished that first book, your subconscious mind from that point forward goes, oh, I can do this. It doesn't make the work any easier in subsequent novels, but you have this sense of assurance and an inner confidence that, okay, I've done this before. It's not going to kill me this time. And it sounds really simplistic, but that will carry you so far as you begin a book again, and then you begin another book, and you begin another book, because there's always this moment of terror, at least for me, maybe I shouldn't speak for everyone, where I sit down at my desk and I see a blinking cursor, and it's this sense of, oh my gosh, I have to take nothing and turn it into something.
Yeah.
And you have to begin at some point, and that beginning is the hardest part, I find.
That's so funny you mentioned that. It was absolutely 100% my next question, is your level of comfort with that process at this point. So at this point, would you call yourself an author?
I think maybe finally I can. I once heard, and I don't know whether this is true, but it made sense to me at the time, that you shouldn't call it a career until you have 5 books.
There you are.
Fair or not, I don't know. I think there are many authors, thinking of Harper Lee here, who had one, and we can all say that her career was just fine. For me, it made sense that I could go, okay, here's progress. I can gauge my progress in this field by this book and that book and that book. And I think I have finally made peace with calling myself an author versus a writer. I was a writer for a long time. Anyone who writes is a writer. I think I finally maybe feel like an author. If my husband was in here, he would be shaking his head and like, here she goes again. But there is a level of confidence that has come with continuing to publish, and as I call it, continuing to land the plane. The plane takes off and you got to get it back on the ground. And it has helped for me.
So of course, obviously I was planning out my questions for this evening and the flow of things, and I so desperately want to jump out of the plan, and because I'm so curious whether this last character had any kind of impact on your confidence level. For those of you who have read the first 2 pages of Codename Hélène, it's just like the confidence just jumps off of the page and slaps you around in the face a little bit. Did that affect you in that way, do you think?
More so than any character I've ever written. So far, all of my novels and characters have been based on either real events or real people. And all of my novels have been populated primarily by people that really lived. And my job has always been to take someone that really existed and make them feel real on paper. They were real in history. I have to make them feel real to the person reading the book. But Nancy was something else. I have never read about any kind of woman like her. And she was real. She's not this plucky product of my imagination. She was a real woman that really lived. And everything that I wrote is backed up not only by her autobiography, but also a number that were written about her.
Mm.
So I just had to get her on the page. And it was really fascinating. Before I wrote this book, for instance, this is sort of a trivial way. I could never wear red lipstick. I felt kind of clownish. But I thought to myself, if Nancy Wake can stop and put on some red lipstick before she jumps out of a plane,
yes,
by golly, I can put this on before I go have a meeting with a school principal.
Yeah. Yeah.
She taught me that it really does work. If a woman walks into a room wearing red lipstick, she automatically has physical presence. And the older I get, that is something that I value more. Being able to command attention by your physical person is a skill set that I think we should teach to young women, because young women have to apply for jobs and colleges and walk into their boss's office and ask for a promotion, and how we present ourselves matters. And Nancy taught me how to do that a little better. And she also taught me that, heck, I'm about to be 43. I need to stop asking permission.
Yes.
Or, as we learn in the novel, but also from her autobiography, she published a lot of articles, and to the best of my knowledge, never got credit for them. Her byline was never there. All of the articles that she wrote for Hearst are lost. And you know what? I think we should get credit for our work. Anybody should get credit for their work, but especially women should get credit for their work and be able to hold it up and say, look, I did this thing. So to answer your question, yes, more so than any character I have ever written, Nancy taught me how to feel comfortable in my own skin and know my worth.
Absolutely. So now I am going to try and jump back on track, because I'm thinking about folks who may have come to join us but have not yet read the book, don't know anything about it. So I've, of course, given a teaser to Name Hélène a few dozen times. I'm sure by this point you've done a few thousand times. So would you mind being the expert, giving us a brief little teaser on the book?
Yes, absolutely. Codename Hélène is based on the life of a woman named Nancy Wake. She was an Australian expat living in Paris right at the outbreak of World War II. She had just bluffed her way into a reporting job for Hearst newspapers and was sort of beginning her rise as a journalist. About the time she got the job, she also met a man named Henry Fiacca. They fall in love. No sooner do they get married than the Germans invade France. And quite literal, all hell broke loose. And as many people did at the time, Nancy kind of looked around and thought, oh my God, I can stand back and do nothing and hope this goes away, or I can do something. And as you may have guessed by now, Nancy was not the sort of woman to do nothing. So she began sort of clandestine work as a courier. First, it was papers that she would smuggle from one end of the country to another that would help people get out of the country. And then she began smuggling people, primarily Jews and downed British pilots. With these fake travel documents, she would take them sort of from the Italian side of France to the Spanish side of France, where then they would go over the Pyrenees Mountains and escape. And she became so good at this work that the Nazis took notice, and they put a 5 million franc price on her head. And she became the most wanted person by the Gestapo throughout any theater for the duration of the war. And as time went on, she soon faced a decision of, I can stay here and continue my work and likely be killed, or I can escape myself. And she took the second option. She left her husband behind in France to hold down the home front, and she escaped to Spain. But she didn't stop there. She took the first boat she could to England and marched herself directly to the Special Operations Executive and became a spy for the British so that they would fly her back to France, which she did, was dropped behind enemy lines. And before really right up at D-Day, she ended up leading 7,000 French resistance fighters into battle. That's the Cliff Notes version. None of that is a spoiler. And
Yes.
when I read that, I thought, I can barely take my children to the grocery store and get back without losing my mind. And this woman is leading men, thousands of them, into battle. And as we know from history, there were so many incredible women that were spies, and they did work that changed the world. But she was the only one that I could find that was a military leader as well.
Mm.
I thought if any story could write itself, it was this one.
Yeah, it's absolutely wild. Some of the things that she does, the choices she makes, and so obviously we've all read the book and we've finished it and we've been sort of meditating on it for a little while, and it strikes me that Nancy just continually makes the choices that I think, regardless of who you are, secretly in 2021, you harbor a desire to have the courage to make those choices as well.
Mm-hmm.
But you also, or at least now I'm really a little therapy session. Now I'm really talking about myself. You also secretly worry that you aren't capable of those choices, of making those brave decisions. And so I'm wondering, were there times where you found Nancy to be a difficult character to live with? I mean, incredibly inspirational, but sometimes, yeah.
Yes. So my editor and I, we often joke that Nancy is basically a comic book character. And the hardest part of telling her story was actually toning her down a little bit, making her more human. To answer your first point, though, I really am convinced after writing her story, and as much as the research as I have done of women in history for all of my books, I don't know that any of us are capable of making those kind of decisions in advance.
Mm.
I don't know that anyone ever has courage to spare. I think courage is a thing that rises up in you when it actually counts, in the moment when it is life or death, whether it's yours or someone else's.
Mm-hmm.
And for everyone in those situations in World War II, I mean, it was a time when your butcher, your baker, your candlestick maker, everyone, ordinary people had to rise up and do extraordinary things. And I really do think there's something in the human spirit in those moments that we become capable of things that we fear we never would otherwise, that kind of bravery. And I have forgotten the second part of your question.
As have I. So we're going to just keep on rolling.
Okay, sorry.
So caught up in what you were saying. No, not at all. And I was also, I was thinking too, when I read the book, that the timing of everything was just eerily apropos. So we have this worldwide pandemic, all sorts of turmoil and unrest here in the US. And then you're reading this incredible story of a woman, but of a whole world, that just as you said, have these things come to meet them where they are. And there is no preparation. There is no concern of worry ahead of time. Am I capable? Am I not? You just find out because the situation is brought to you. So I actually found all that very comforting, the timing of everything. So yeah, it was I'm also, so just like you said, you're bringing her down, you're making her more human, but you're also doing amazing things with the timeline. Amazing. So I will say, at first, when I first started reading the book, I had a hard time adjusting to everything, because not only are you doing this incredible thing with timeline, but Nancy is just bigger than life. So every single section is just filled with action and emotion and just all of this stuff. But as you progress through the book, as a reader, I really begin to appreciate how these two timelines are sort of melding together, almost like a little Mobius strip, and you get to the end and brings you to the beginning, and it's just it's wonderful. And I'm just curious about the logistics of that. How did you craft that? How did you keep it straight? Did you decide what the timelines would be and then sort of work them together, or did you create it in the order that people would experience it?
Again, all of the above.
Yeah.
Well, the decision to frame the story the way it was had to do with a specific moment while I was researching early in the story, before I knew what the book was going to be or how it was going to be formatted. I read a story about how one of Nancy's first assignments as a new journalist was to go interview the newly appointed chancellor in Germany, Adolf Hitler.
Mm.
So on one hand, here's this young woman interviewing Adolf Hitler, but then you fast forward 8 years and she kills a Nazi with her bare hands. And I kind of sat back in my chair and I thought, oh my gosh, how does this girl, young green journalist, go from interviewing him to killing one of his henchmen with her bare hands? And then I thought, okay, that's really the answer, or that's the question I have to answer as the story progresses. So that is why we start with Nancy in that airplane parachuting into France in the very first chapter. And then we kick it back 8 years to her as a young journalist. And we really are just switching back and forth between those two things. Both timelines move forward consecutively, but we're switching from Nancy at war to Nancy becoming a warrior.
Mm.
And regarding the shape of it, you mentioned a Mobius strip. It's one of my, I don't know, it's one of my favorite shapes. But for this particular story, I asked myself the question that I ask every time I sit down to write a book, which is quite simply, what is the shape of this story? With my first novel, I knew it was a braid. I was braiding 3 different points of view together. That novel's called The Wife, the Maid, and the Mistress. And then with my second novel, Flight of Dreams, I knew that I had a locked box, compressed time scenario. So I knew the shape of my story was a box. With my third novel, I Was Anastasia, I knew that I was dealing with this double helix. There were these 2 women. Are they the same person or are they not the same person? This double helix, it would mirror itself. And then with Nancy, I just kept seeing a circle. So throughout the novel, we have all of these full circle moments. She'll meet somebody here. You have no idea what their relationship is to her, but then you go back and then you see them meet for the first time and then the circle closes. And even the way that the novel ended, it ends at the beginning. It ends at the same point that it begins, which I was able to do because those 2 timelines are running consecutively, but because one is 8 years behind, it finally catches up with the other. And that part of it, the structure, the figuring it out, the technical challenge of putting it together is the fun part for me. We were chatting beforehand, before we came on, that I can never read my books when they're done. I don't ever read them the way that I read anyone else's work because I'm the one that did it. I know how the rabbit was smuggled into the hat. I know who done it. I know how the story comes together. So I can never see it as a whole piece. So for me, I get my fun in the process of having a mess on my hands that I then have to trim and fix and rearrange. And it's like, I don't know, doing a jigsaw puzzle, only on this massive cerebral level, and you can't actually see the pieces. They're all in your head.
Yes, yes. And I'll say too that for me as a reader, that was also one of the most pleasurable parts of the read, was at the end having that structure revealed.
Yes.
It I mean, you do have a sense, but you're just so wrapped up in the actual action points of it. And then at the very end, you put that last final piece in the puzzle, and then I get to step away and say, "Oh, that is the completed puzzle," without perhaps having seen the picture on the cover of the box.
One of my favorite things when I was writing, Nancy has a partner, not a romantic partner, but she has her partner at war. His name is Hubert. They each have these code names. She is Helene, he is Hubert. And they have this sort of a, I don't know.
Yeah.
Not adversarial, but I think of them bickering the way that a brother and sister might bicker, or old cranky grandparents or something. And then you get to the very end of the novel and you see her meeting him for the first time. You see who he is and how that connects. And I I had so much fun doing that, putting that together.
You can tell that the joyousness and the enjoyment of her life really do come through on the page. So I'm going to pause in my questions and take a quick look at questions that are being posted onto Facebook. I don't want to ignore people. And so, of course, if you've been thinking about something you'd like to ask, please be sure to post that. So the first one from an audience member is, was there a fascinating story or fact that you learned during research that didn't make it into the book?
Yes, one of my favorite stories about Nancy actually had to hit the cutting room floor, and I'm so sad because it just made me laugh.
Mhm.
During the war, I want to say it was the second part of the German occupation. At first, Germany took northern France, and that was the occupied zone, and southern France was the free zone, and then eventually Germany took the whole thing. So it was after Germany had taken the whole thing. There were food rations, and they came in and they would take all the livestock from people. So there was very little to eat, and what there was to eat was rationed. But here we have Nancy, and Nancy wants some bacon. She just wants some bacon. She wants a pork chop. So she finds a farmer out in the middle of nowhere. She buys this tiny little piglet from him, and then she pays to have somebody else raise it. Eventually, it's time to process the pig. She goes there, and she's going back to Marseille with 2 suitcases full of pork chops and bacon and roasts to take home for herself, but also for her friends and family, and to help distribute and make sure that those in her life are well fed. But it's all contraband. She's not allowed to have it. And she gets on the train and she gets to her spot. Well, these suitcases are really heavy and she can't lift them. And all the luggage goes on these racks up there. And sitting across from her in her compartment is a German Nazi officer, but all he sees is a pretty young lady with a couple suitcases. So he kind of heaves these things up on the shelf. And she's thinking, oh my gosh, if he finds out what's in there, I am toast. So she proceeds to flirt with him the entire train ride back to Marseille. They get there and he heaves them down. And at this point, he's starting to realize something is off. Like, clothes don't weigh this much. Now he's carrying her suitcases and he's trying to be chivalrous because she's flirting with him. And anyway, she kind of cons him into carrying these suitcases full of contraband through the checkpoint. And finally he looks at her and he goes, this is all contraband, isn't it? And she just smiles and she says, yes, it is. And if you get discovered, we're both going to prison. So they get through safely. He sets them down. He wishes her a good night and walks away.
Wow.
Never in 100 years would I think to do something like that. But she did it all the time.
And it absolutely makes perfect sense. You can completely picture this happening for sure. If anyone could bluff her way in and then out or something like that, it would be Nancy Wade. Very nice. I see another set of questions that popped up, so we'll take care of that too. Another audience member asks if you read historical fiction, and what books do you recommend to other fans of the genre?
I do read historical fiction. I love historical fiction. I cannot read it when I am writing it, particularly at the end of a deadline. Mainly because when you compare your unfinished work to somebody else's masterpiece, my brain melts and I think, oh, I should just quit and go be a greeter at Walmart because my stuff is terrible.
Yeah.
So I save historical for when I'm not deep in a deadline. But that said, some of my favorite stuff, obviously, Dinah Gabaldon writes amazing historical fiction. Diane Setterfield, her novels, The 13th Tale and Once Upon a River, are 2 of my absolute favorites. A really fun series that I go to when I just need to rediscover the joy of reading is the Veronica Speedwell series by Deanna Rayburn. It's set in Victorian England and she investigates murders, and it's just delightful and fun and a joy. I love Susanna Kersley. I love, oh gosh, I'm not in my office right now, or I would look at my shelf and tell you, but I very much enjoy historical fiction.
And some of those that you mentioned too, I'm familiar with. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. Here's a good question, absolutely, that I wanted to circle back around to at some point. So, in one of your author's notes, you wrote that books are never done;
Mm-hmm.
they're due.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, the natural question is, how do you determine when to stop? Or do
I,
you just look at the calendar and say, "What? There we go."
so the phrase deadline, I did not realize, is an old military term, and it
Huh.
literally means if you cross this line, they shoot you dead.
There you go.
So the date on the calendar, no one is going to shoot me, thankfully. But it's a hard stop. And I really do think that one of the reasons that I have written as many books as I have and have kept my spot in the publishing industry is because I have a lot of respect for a deadline. I try to never miss them. If I have to get a little bit more time, it's usually because of circumstances outside of my control. But I work toward a date on a calendar. I work toward two things. I work toward a date on a calendar, and I work toward a specific moment at the end of a manuscript. And I have learned that you can fiddle with pages forever. You can tweak them and mess with them. But I am pretty much going to give you the same book if you give me 6 years or if you give me 1 year. So I might as well take 1 year and then write another one.
Speaking of deadlines, I was curious about this as well for Codename Hélène. So, it was first published, I think, about March of last year, so about a year ago. But the paperback was just recently released. And so I'm curious about, I know everyone's completely sick to death of talking about it, but it is a worldwide pandemic. How did COVID affect your publishing experience, or any other ways in which it might have affected you as a writer?
Oh gosh, all of the ways, really. This is the first novel I've ever had where I could not go meet people or talk to people in person. Like, for instance, what we're doing tonight, under other circumstances, I would get to go Dyersburg, correct? I would get to go to Dyersburg and I'd get to sit in a room with you, and we would hopefully pass a microphone back and forth at the front of a room, and I could look you in the eyes in a more accurate way than I can on a screen. And in a perfect world, there would be a couple dozen people with us, and we could interact on a personal level. And obviously none of that could happen this year. The world kind of fell apart the week this book came out. The week this book was published was the week that everything really went. In particular, bookstores across the country closed. We had to pivot about a week and a half before I was set to go on tour and turn everything online. And it was kind of a big experiment. I vastly prefer in-person interactions. I love people. I'm an extrovert. This is the fun part of my job. The one good thing is that I got to sleep in my bed every night, which does not happen during book tour. And I was home. I was home all spring, all year. But typically spring is my busy travel time. And it also happens to be the time of the year that all of our boys play baseball, which would have left my husband juggling 4 different boys with 4 different baseball teams. And that would have been bananas. Baseball didn't happen either. So nothing happened and we were all home. And I think we'd really assumed that by this time, everything would have gone back to normal, and that didn't happen. So I released this book twice online, and it was a really fascinating experiment to see. The first time when it came out in hardcover, everyone was trying to figure out, how do we do online events? By the time it came out in paperback, it was like this well-oiled machine, and everyone knew how to do it. And we were all referring to ourselves as Zoomin' humans. It will probably always be the most unique book release I've ever had. But I have a book, and it came out in the world, and I got to share this story with people, and it has been so rewarding to hear back from other people just how much they enjoyed Nancy. And how she made them laugh during a pandemic. I mean, it is a World War II book, make no mistake. It's a story that has some teeth to it, but she was so funny. And I love how there are these moments of levity balanced against these moments of darkness.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Let's see, I see another question come up from Facebook. Oh, I see two. So the first one is, do you ever think Nancy's articles with Hearst will ever be discovered? Will you write more about Nancy? And then I'll let you answer that one. I'll have the next
Yeah,
one.
great question. I don't know. To be fair, I spent many, 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 many months trying to find them, and then finally looked at the calendar at that date with the red circle and realized I had a lot of book left to write and not enough time to do it. So I had to give up my search. I did not contact anyone from Hearst. It would have been a really fun experiment. I didn't need the articles to write the book. It would have been really helpful, but it wasn't necessary. So I had to abandon that search in pursuit of finishing the book that is out now. I would love to find them. I would really love, in particular, to read the article that she wrote when she interviewed Hitler. She was not impressed with him, obviously. I would love to see how she phrased it. I think it would take somebody within the bowels of the Hearst organization to make that happen. Yeah. Whether or not I will write more about her, I don't know, but I will say that she is the one character I've written about that I think I would have a great deal of fun returning to. Her life after the war, her kind of foray into politics in Australia was fascinating. There's enough there. Whether or not I will go back, I'm not sure.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned a bit about her life after the war and her life in Australia. I've got to touch on this. So for those of you listening who haven't looked into Nancy's life after Name Hélène, I'm going to just very briefly read some of the medals that she received: the George Medal from Britain, the Resistance Medal, Legion of Honor Medal, the Cross of War Medal with 2 bronze palms and a silver star, all from France, the Medal of Freedom from the US, but then was turned down for a recommended award from Australia, her home country. And I'm sure no one would be surprised that this is her response, and I quote, but I'm not gonna quote it all. She says, "I told the government they could stick their medals where the monkey." And you can just imagine, yeah, everything that comes after that. The thing is, if they gave me a medal now, it wouldn't be love. So I don't want anything from them. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious to hear from you, Ariel. So as you dug into your life, did you find all of her responses to this rejection to be as consistently, I don't know about flippant, but just to disregard that action that Australia took, or did you find underneath all that a level of disappointment or sadness?
I am, it's conjecture here because all I have to go with are the recorded answers that she has. No one can ask her anymore. She passed away in 2011, I believe. Not a spoiler, of natural causes at the age of 99. I think she would have liked to make it to 100. I would assume, from what I have read and known about her, that it probably hurt her on some level. She was very proud to be Australian. She was born in New Zealand, raised in Australia, and she loved her home country. She called herself a French woman toward the end of her life because she'd spent so much of her life in Europe. But she was really proud of where she came from. And just as a human, I would assume that bothered her. Originally, the Australian government would not give her the medal because she had not technically fought for the Australian army. She fought for the British and the French, with the French for the British. I think there was an element in her that was like, I'll show you. I don't need it. I will go find something else. And one of the things I'm most sad about is that she passed away before I ever found this story. I would have loved to interview her. And I will say this, if you've read the book, after we finish tonight, pour yourself a glass of wine and go to YouTube and search up the interviews of Nancy Wake. She gave a number of them in her later years, and you get to see her with all of that vim and all of that vigor that she had as a young woman. She kept every ounce of it until the day she died, and it is so much fun to see her talk about all of this in her own words, with her own voice and her face. And I highly recommend you do yourself that favor.
Oh, I'm so glad you suggested that. That is for sure and I'm sure at least a dozen other people are going to be doing at 7 o'clock tonight. So, all right, before I keep on going with my own questions again, I want to pause and take a look at our Facebook questions. We have one more, which is, how do you pace yourself in your writing journey so you can meet those deadlines?
Excellent question. Two things really help. First is I'm just stubborn enough to where I don't want to fail. So I'm very aware of where I am in the process and what that end goal is. But a very specific tool that I use is a program called Scrivener. It's a writing program. I do all of my drafting in Scrivener. And then when it comes time for editing, I move everything to Word. But Scrivener has a function in there called targets, the targets function. So if I know I want my book to be 100,000 words long, Helene is a good bit longer than that. But let's just say I want my book to be 100,000 words long. It's roughly 320 pages, manuscript form. And I know that it has to be done on X date. That targets function will tell me how many words I have to write today. Every day I open the manuscript and it will adjust. Like if yesterday I wrote none, but 3 days ago I wrote 4 times as many as I need, it will adjust to the amount of words that I have now versus when it's due.
Yeah.
And I look at that every day. I sit down to work. I open Scrivener. I click the targets function and I say, okay, today I have to write no less than 500 words, which is roughly 2 pages. And I don't leave my desk most days until I've hit that target. And it's really simple, but it keeps me on track.
That sounds like an incredible program. So clever. Yeah. What a way to you make it approachable. Yeah.
And you really do just have to take small bites. It's to think, oh my gosh, I have to write a book. Your brain will melt. But if you sit down and you go, okay, I have to write a paragraph. Everybody can write a paragraph. And then it's, okay, I just have to write a page. Everyone can write a page.
Yeah.
All I have to do is write a scene. All I have to do is write a chapter. Those are manageable things that can get you through day after day after day, and you finish the work.
Let me ask you another question about the process and role of an author. So it just historical fiction seems like a huge, weighty responsibility, fictionalizing historical events and real people. Could you share a little bit about that? How do you find a balance? I know that's a big one.
No, I kind of have 2 different ways that I describe writing historical fiction. If everything is going well, I think of it as wrestling an octopus into a mayonnaise jar. It's slippery and it's out of control, and I just got to cram it in there. That's if it's going well.
Yes.
If it's going badly, I think of it as juggling chainsaws, except I'm blindfolded and the chainsaws are on fire. It is so much to wrestle. There's the job of taking this moment in history and turning it into a compelling story. But then there's also the job of, there are 50,000 things that I can include in this story. What are the ones that are relevant to the story that I'm telling today? So it's lots of organization. It's lots of making decisions. Like the pig in the suitcase was so funny. And I drafted the scene, and then I looked at it later and I thought, this is really funny, but it doesn't have a place in the story. It doesn't connect to anything else. It is just Nancy doing a funny thing. So I cut it out. And you have to be really precise with those decisions. And that's, in all honesty, a lot where my editor comes in. She will say, okay, Ariel, Nancy is awesome, but she's kind of like a cartoon character. We have to make her more human if anyone is going to believe this at all. Yes, it all happened, but you have to believe that it happened. And that's where you come in with precision, and you cut and you splice and you dice. Or, for instance, some of the really harder things. There are 2 scenes in the book that are really hard. They were very violent. And in my defense, they really happened. I didn't make either of those things up. And they were terrible to write. But I had to tell myself, Nancy saw it and Nancy lived it. And she had to deal with this. I can't have any less guts than she did. But you also don't want to make it too much. So it's decisions and finessing, and her response to those 2 events I found really telling. That's how you show a woman is human. How do you respond when you've seen the hard, awful thing? Versus Nancy being brave, you have Nancy weeping in a corner or Nancy puking in the bushes.
Yeah.
Because it was hard and it was awful.
So that makes me think of a big question that we already talked about, that I've been burning up to ask you. I'm actually going to read what I typed because I want to make sure I make it as spoiler free as possible. But if you're out there and you've not read the book, I'm going to give you just a moment. You can find the mute button on your screen. Because there's a chance, but I'm going to be as tricky and careful as I can. Okay. So there is a character whose role, whose function, whose motivation is called into question in the final pages, in the author's note. And so every one of us here at the library, when we read that part of the book, we just about fell out of our seats, just totally gobsmacked. And so questions about all this. How did you research the character? What were you hoping their presence would do to the storyline or to the other characters? Is this character inspired by anybody in particular? I would ask more, but I feel like I'm already tempting.
So I believe we are talking about a woman named Marceline, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The specific character, as I wrote her, did not exist. She is a conglomeration of 3 different women throughout the book. Part of what she represents are the women that Nancy's husband dated before he met her. Before he met her, he was like a ladies' man, and they liked him quite a bit in return. So I took that group of women and I merged them with there was a group of women, there were a group of people in France. They were called collaborationists. They collaborated with the Germans. They betrayed their fellow Frenchmen and they began to work with the Germans. And what they did was awful. And a number of them were women. There were quite a few women in France who took Germany's side and did some really terrible things. So I took the women that Henri dated and I combined them with collaborationists. And then toward the end of the novel, there is a woman in the forest and a thing happens that was 100% true. So the character of Marceline is this portrait of all 3 of those events. And I wanted her to be real and to have an intimate, deep impact on Nancy's life and her activities in the war, her marriage, her time in Marseille. And the best way to do that was to take those 3 significant individuals or groups of people and combine them into one person that had flesh and blood. But the events, the things that happen, even there's this woman, Marceline, is present when Nancy meets Henri's father for the first time. And they have a bit of a kerfuffle.
Yeah, yes.
Even that is true. What Nancy says at the end of that scene when she looks at Henri's father and she gives a very biting remark, that was true.
See, yes, this is absolutely one of those books where then you need to go back through once you see that structure and how it all fits, once you know about Marceline, and appreciate everything all over again.
Mm-hmm.
Whew, okay, before I get carried away, I'm I'm going to squeeze in one last question because I have gotten so interested and involved in our conversation. I see that it's getting close to 7 o'clock. So the final question, and actually the final question I saw popped up, but we've already discussed it, and it was how you developed Marceline. So that's wonderful. All right. Well, I want to, of course, I was going to ask you about your upcoming book, but maybe
you can do that.
Okay.
I don't have to be anywhere. So if you have a couple more questions, I'm all yours.
That puppy in. Okay. Well, then, yes, I saw a mention of the Frozen River.
Mm-hmm.
Want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I am about halfway through. So some days it's the octopus in the mayonnaise jar. Sometimes it's the flaming chainsaws. Just, it's a wreck. But it has to be a wreck before it can be put together. So this is just part of the process. It is tentatively called The Frozen River, and it is based on the life of a woman named Martha Ballard. And she was a midwife in late 1700s Maine. So I'm going way back this time. I've been early 20th century. I'm going back to the late 18th century. The fascinating thing about Martha, and the first reason I became interested in her life, is that over the course of 30 years, she delivered over 1,000 babies and never lost a mother in childbirth. She had a perfect survival rate for mothers. Things happen,
oh my goodness,
in infants because nobody can control that, but she never, ever lost a mother. And modern doctors today can't boast a track record like that. It's astonishing how skilled this woman was. She was the aunt of Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross.
Yes.
And she was the grandmother of one of the first female physicians in the United States, the first woman to be inducted into the New England Medical Society. So her legacy on the medical field in our country cannot be overstated. She was amazing. In addition to her prowess as a midwife, she kept a diary for that 30 years. And remember, this is a time when most women could neither read nor write. And here she is keeping a diary. And in it, she records everything that happens in her small community, every birth, every death, every murder, every scandal. And on the pages of her diary is the only written record of a rape trial that changed the legal system in our country. So the book that I'm writing, it's a murder mystery. I wanted to go back to a good old-fashioned murder mystery like my first novel. But woven into it, it's funny you mentioned the Mobius strip, is that rape trial. It's a murder mystery, but it's a rape trial. But it's a murder mystery, but it's a rape trial. And the two are intricately woven together. And the way that I feel every time I write a book, it will either be amazing or the worst book ever written.
That sounds incredible. Before you even got to the bit about a rape trial and a murder mystery, just this woman and her history and her progeny are incredible already.
Yeah.
Wow.
And again, no one has ever heard of her. And I don't know that I ever set out to like write about the women that nobody's heard of, but I am compelled to tell these stories. I really feel like Nancy should be a household name. Little girls should dress up as for Halloween as Nancy Wake in their red lipstick and their French berets. They should do it. And people should know who Martha Ballard was. I mean, she inspired Clara Barton, who went on to found the American Red Cross. That's a big deal. And no one knows who she is. So I have this compulsion occasionally to make sure that people aren't forgotten. And I do believe that women historically have not gotten their place and their time in the history books. And I can't change that, but I can tell their stories.
Mm-hmm. And thank goodness you are too. Absolutely. We need more people doing that, capturing their voices.
Thank you.
Oh, goodness. Okay. It is 7 o'clock on the dot, so I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. I cannot say thank you enough, Ariel, for joining us, and then of course to Patrick and Serenity and all of those at Humane Sensei who made this evening possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us. And of course, there are lots of resources we've already mentioned that you can go to if you want to learn more about Ariel, Nancy, or her work. So thank you again, everybody.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.